Welcome back to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
And welcome back. So this is The Social Workers. I am Eric Hardiman, your co-host here with Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hi, Eric.
And we've just been listening to an archival interview that Alyssa did, but right now we've got a special guest on the telephone with us. And Alyssa, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, Robert Swidler is the VP of Legal Services for St. Peter's Health Partners, the Capital Region's largest healthcare systems, with 5 hospitals, 7 nursing homes, a medical practice with over 350 physicians, and many other facilities and services. Mr. Swidler is also the editor of the New York State Bar Association Health Law Journal, a governor's appointee to the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, and an adjunct faculty member. So over the years, Mr. Swidler has had a significant role in drafting and advocating for several healthcare laws, including the New York State Healthcare Policy Law in 1990 and the Family Healthcare Decisions Act in 2010. So we're really excited to have him on today to really talk about end-of-life issues and bring in some of that legal aspect, because he is a lawyer, to bring in some of that legal aspect of what we should know and how we can prepare.
Great. Welcome, Robert. Thanks for being our guest today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's nice to be here.
So the topic that we've decided we'll be talking about today is end-of-life decision-making and end-of-life decision processes. And I'm wondering, sometimes when we have guests on the show, we talk about the fact that our listenership here at the radio is a community listenership. We have some students, we have faculty members, and we also have people in the wider community. So when you talk about end-of-life decisions in general, can you sort of give us the definition and sort of what types of decisions are we talking about?
Well, what I'm focusing on today, or what I think our listeners may be interested in by end-of-life decisions, is decisions to discontinue or to withhold some kind of treatment that has some promise of sustaining or prolonging the patient's life. So, for instance, discontinuing a ventilator that is keeping somebody alive, discontinuing artificial nutrition, hydration, or the most typical end-of-life decision is the entry of a do not resuscitate order, which doesn't have any effect immediately, but it indicates that in the event this patient's heart stops, don't come in with the equipment and techniques to try to get the heart started again. So that's probably the most common end-of-life decision that patients face and that family members face on behalf of incapable patients.
Okay, great.
And this is a topic that, it doesn't mean you're, older or having some sort of illness to think about this. This type of issue can be for someone who's young, correct? Is this something that we all should be thinking about?
Yeah, sadly, these issues do arise from time to time with younger people. It's more common with older people, and we face issues of DNR orders and withdrawal or withholding of treatment in nursing homes for elderly population. But yes, anybody with a critical, life-threatening illness may be confronted with these kind of issues, yes.
And how did you get involved originally in working in this area? What was your entree, if you will, into this particular topic?
Well, as a young lawyer in 1980, oh my goodness, I should have thought about this in advance. So in 1985, I took a job with the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, which was an advisory body that Governor Mario Cuomo had just put together to make recommendations on policies on end-of-life and other medical ethics issues. And I became their staff attorney, and we developed the healthcare proxy law, New York's DNR law, New York's regulation on brain death. So I've been working on these areas for a long time in different capacities, but that's how I got involved in it.
Yeah. And I would imagine that the conversation has changed over those years, that this has become more in the public discourse, that there's been more awareness. But how have you seen that change over the years, if you have?
Well, yeah, I guess I've seen it two ways. One is that the laws have become more clear and prescriptive and cover areas that there was greater uncertainty about in the past, and now they are much more clearly regulated. But I think there's also been enormous cultural change over that period of time. So thinking back to when I first got involved in this, somebody having a living will was considered something idiosyncratic, maybe even eccentric, and now it's not quite idiosyncratic or eccentric to not have one, but it's really acceptable to have one and is seen as part of the basic set of documents that somebody, particularly an older person or a person facing a serious illness, would have.
And you mentioned a lot about laws. And what are some of the rules in New York about discontinuing life-sustaining treatment?
Right. Well, I guess there's three. The way I think about this is in three different categories. So there are patients who have decisional capacity, which really means the ability to understand risks, benefits, and alternatives and make a reasoned decision. And there we don't have a lot of laws because we have case law that affirms a very clear principle in New York that for the most part patients with capacity have the right to make decisions about what treatment is provided to them and the right to forego treatment, even life-sustaining treatment. The areas where we have a lot of statutes and regulations relate to patients who lack capacity. So one of the key laws we have there is New York's healthcare proxy law that was adopted in 1990 that says if I appoint somebody to make healthcare decisions for me and then lose capacity, that person can make any decision I could have made, including foregoing life-sustaining treatment. Mm-hmm. And there's no particular clinical preconditions that have to be met. The only requirement is the person has to make the decision based on my wishes if known, or else my best interests if my wishes are not known. The more difficult issue is for people who have not, patients who have not appointed anybody and then lose capacity. And there we have New York's Family Healthcare Decisions Act adopted finally in 2010 after many years of debate.
Okay.
That we can talk about further if you like, and sets up a mechanism for getting a decision for an incapable patient.
Yeah, how has that changed practice? You say that was enacted in 2010?
Yes, in 2010. It was first proposed by the Task Force on Life and the Law that I'd worked for something like 18 years earlier and was the subject of a very long debate. But it was passed in 2010. I think it's changed practice for the better. It has really clarified who a decision maker is for an incapable patient who didn't appoint somebody, what the standard is for when they can make a decision for withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, and what clinical preconditions have to be met, and a number of other documentation rules about determining incapacity and so forth. So it really brought this out of the shadows and clarified what the rules are, and made it clear that it was lawful to turn to a family member for these decisions when the conditions in the law are met.
Okay. And I guess ideally, you mentioned family members. Ideally, the conversation about end-of-life decision-making happens earlier rather than sort of at the final moments. And, I wonder if you have some thoughts about sort of timing and when should these conversations with family members initially happen? So if a listener out there, for example, has an older relative that they're concerned about, at what point is it appropriate to start thinking about and talking with physicians and talking with other advocates about these decisions?
Well, here again, I kind of break this into two categories. There's the general public, including myself and including you, Eric, and you, Alyssa. Mm-hmm. A basic document everybody should think about having is a healthcare proxy, mm-hmm. because that at least you can designate somebody who you trust to make healthcare decisions for you if the unexpected event occurs and you lack capacity to make them for yourself. And because that's valuable not just for end-of-life treatment, but somebody who will then have the clear authority to consent to treatment on your behalf. So I look at that as a general tool of broad applicability. That's a good idea for all of us to have in place. And to the extent you have wishes or strong views about, I wouldn't want to have treatment in these circumstances, you can include that in the document, but you don't need to. Mm-hmm. But the other category that where these issues are more pressing are elderly people and people facing life-threatening diseases, and there you want to be more specific, and the kind of document we encourage in our system, and I think is broadly encouraged in New York State, is a MOLST, a medical order for life-sustaining treatment, and that is a document, or increasingly it's information posted online through an eMOLST practice, in which patient can specify the kinds of treatments they would want and the kinds of circumstances where they would want treatment withheld or withdrawn. And it's not only an expression of the patient's wishes, but it's a doctor's order, so it will be followed by staff if the event occurs that where the circumstances come into effect.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an important topic. I remember I went to, it was a while ago, a little training at the Albany Guardianship Society, and they were talking about how important it is, and they gave us the form for the healthcare proxy and a folder where we could keep all the information and sort of a checklist. And I remember I took a few copies, but I really wanted to share it with some people that I knew. And, some people filled it out, completed it, realized the importance. And there was some other individuals who it can be a hard topic to talk about, especially when we're talking about death and dying, and some people tried to avoid it. They're, I'll get to it later. I don't want to think about that right now. So what are some how do we try to get people if there is that resistance? Do you find there's any sort of strategy to bring up this topic to especially people who are older, who might not want to think about end of life? How do we get them to realize the importance of it? This is important because it's helping to plan, for helping the individuals caring for you to plan, or what strategies, if any, do you have to address that?
Okay, well, this is an area where I think there has been enormous culture change that I was referring to previously. And patients in general, we're finding are more comfortable having these conversations, and are disappointed when the issue is not brought up, or when the doctor is reluctant to raise the issue. But in any event, whenever a patient is admitted to a hospital now, there's at least an inquiry about whether you have an advance directive, and the availability of information about advance directives like healthcare proxies and living wills, if the patient wants to pursue that. If a patient is identified as having a life-threatening illness, we do offer information about palliative care, including advance directives. And if a patient does not want to have that conversation, they're not pressured into it at all, but we make sure that the opportunity to have that conversation is presented to them. But I think in terms of the sensitivity of this, again, turning to people like the three of us, the idea of having a healthcare proxy should not be that touchy a conversation. We're not necessarily focusing on withdrawal or withholding of life-sustaining treatment, just identifying a decision maker who is more likely to know our wishes and our interests and our values and our personality.
Yeah. So if you've just tuned in, I just want to remind listeners that you are listening to the Social Workers Live Radio Talk Show, and our special guest via telephone today is Robert Swidler. Robert is the Vice President of Legal Services for St. Peter's Health Partners here in Albany.
So we've been talking a little bit about the laws and the new laws that have come out. Do you see any need for further amendments to these laws or new laws in the areas, or is everything sort of good right now with the way the laws are established?
Yeah, I do see some need for different amendments. I think we made enormous progress in 2010 with the Family Healthcare Decisions Act, and that has worked very well, in my view, as a policy initiative in New York State. Really has helped a lot. But with experience on it, now we're hearing about different tweaks that could be made and improvements that could be made, and areas that it doesn't reach that it should reach. So, for instance, I think it has some cumbersome provisions about the determining the incapacity of patients that are too strict for certain purposes, and also too strict for patients with developmental disabilities or mental illness.
Yeah.
And we need to change that. And there are some bills that would do that, and I would really like to see progress on those bills. Another area is that there's a separate law for end-of-life decisions for people with developmental disabilities. We have that for historical reasons, and it predates the Family Healthcare Decisions Act. And in my view, it makes sense to consolidate those laws and take some of the special protections from that and build it into family healthcare decisions so that staff don't have to learn two laws. It's complicated enough already. And I think a third area is Family Healthcare Decisions Act only applies in hospitals, nursing homes, and to hospice patients. And that's where most of these issues arise, but increasingly we see there'd be a value to have a Family Healthcare Decisions Act type process in home care and maybe even other settings to figure out to help provide guidance on who a decision maker is for incapable patients. I mean, you may need a decision maker in a dentist's office to consent to treatment, or in a doctor's office or AmSurg center. So we need to extend Family Healthcare Decisions Act into other settings as well. Even if we don't have end-of-life decisions in those settings, we have consent to treatment issues in those settings.
And this may not be a question for which there are empirical data available yet, but are there any disparities in terms of who has access to these types of supports? So I'm thinking, for example, of individuals in homeless shelters or individuals on Medicaid and in impoverished areas, who maybe interact with the healthcare system in different ways than people with other types of health insurance. Are you aware of, or is there some conversation around health disparities and, or not health disparities, but disparities to access around support for decision making?
Well, that's a good question. There clearly are disparities in access to health care.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Once somebody is in a hospital or nursing home, a law like Family Healthcare Decisions Act applies to them, whatever their economic circumstance or background. It's just saying if you didn't appoint somebody in advance, these are the people who will have the authority, and you lack capacity, these are the people who will have authority to make decisions for you. So in that sense, it applies to everybody. The issue you may not realize you're touching on, that I think you were touching on, is that we sadly see a lot of patients who have no family members, who are just isolated or just lost connection with their family. And Family Healthcare Decisions has a good process for getting consent or treatment for such patients, but it's still problematic on the issue of withdrawal or withholding of life-sustaining treatment. We don't have pretty much any good process for that. Recently, there's been a process that was approved last year by the legislature to create a hospital-based process to enroll people who are isolated into hospice if they are hospice qualified. So that will help us in that category.
Yeah.
Yeah, isolated patients is a continuing problem.
Okay. And in social work, those are a lot of the populations that we work with and that our students and future social workers will be working with. So that's, it's certainly a population that we think about quite a bit.
Well, as social workers, the way you can really help, again, I keep coming back to this, is to promote healthcare proxies, because even if somebody is isolated and doesn't have family, they may have a friend, they may have somebody they trust, and that will give that person the assurance that the person they trust will be making decisions for them, and it will give the healthcare staff confidence in relying upon that person because the patient appointed them.
Yeah.
Now, do you see many disputes about end-of-life care in your system, and how do they get resolved?
They arise from time to time. It's not that often. I mean, because a lot of people only hear about these cases in the media when there is a dispute.
Yeah.
They don't realize the vast majority of these cases, either there's no dispute, and in the past the problem had not been solving disputes. It's been nobody had authority even when there wasn't a dispute, and we've solved that. When there is a dispute, usually time will resolve that issue, time and discussion, and good social work. Oh my goodness, it's social workers who are at the middle of that and play a key role in bringing family members into a consensus. When you just say dispute, They come in all kinds of variations, a dispute between what staff is recommending and what the surrogate wants, a dispute between different family members, or one that I've written about is a dispute between what the patient previously said they want and were very firm about, and then lose capacity, and then a family member says, I don't really care what mom told you, I'm telling you to do this.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult case. From an ethical and legal standpoint, our obligation is really clear. It's to follow the patient's direction to us. You can imagine from a risk management and community relations and difficulty on staff standpoint, it's very difficult because you're dealing with a silent patient and a very assertive, often family member. So that's where we rely a lot upon social workers to help us resolve those cases.
Great. So all of this fits, I believe, in some ways into the context of perhaps the rubric of bioethics. And I know you're involved with the Alden March Bioethics Center at Albany Medical College. And I wonder if you could just, sort of tell listeners a little bit about what bioethics is and sort of how that fits into the conversation. Okay.
Well, I may be the only person that makes this distinction, but I kind of make a distinction between medical ethics and bioethics. I'm looking at medical ethics as a subset of bioethics that deals with these patient care decisions and deals with patients, whereas bioethics, I think, raises a whole bunch of broader issues about genetic innovations and research involving human stem cell research.
Sure.
So I think it raises all these kind of ethical issues in biology that are broader than medicine.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I see medical ethics as a subset of that. So in Alden March, which is the ethics center located at Albany Medical Center, they deal with a broad range of bioethics issues there. I'm on their adjunct faculty and teach a course on end-of-life legal and ethical and medical issues in end-of-life decision-making. So that's my narrow piece of it, the topic we're talking about today.
And so doctors or doctors-to-be, medical students that take that course, then so that they're given an entire course in this specific topic, it sounds like. Is that a required course?
No, it's a graduate level course for people heading for a master's in bioethics.
I see, okay.
So it's one of the curriculum for their bioethics for their bioethics program. Now, it's the students in it are a really diverse group and range from law students to social workers to nurses to doctors to clergymen to people with a philosophy background and other just interested people interested in the topic with an unrelated career. But it's a graduate level course that attracts doctors, but is not a required part of the medical school curriculum.
Sure. And I like how you mentioned, listed all the individuals who might take this course, because it is such an important topic. It's not just something that only impacts those who work in hospitals. It really can, it touches many different professions, and it's something that we all need to sort of be aware of in some way, shape, or form, how this impacts the individuals we might be working with. Now,
I think that's true.
Yeah. So is there a difference between end-of-life care systems between different hospitals, or is there certain things that, is every hospital the same or every end-of-life facility the same?
Well, I don't know that I want to say the same, but we all are now governed by a fairly prescriptive set of requirements under Family Health Care Decisions Act for patients who lack capacity. So our hospitals at St. Peter's Health Partners follow those. Down the street at Albany Medical Center, they follow those, and other hospitals in New York State follow those. There's probably greater variation as you move to other states, but within New York, we're all following those. Now, in St. Peter's Health Partners, some of our hospitals are Catholic hospitals, and all of our hospitals have committed not to violate ethical and religious directives, but we've found that those are largely consistent with Family Health Care Decisions Act principles. So we have not found, I think you'd be hard-pressed to see a difference on an end-of-life case the way it's handled in any of the St. Peter's Health Partners hospitals and Albany Medical Center or any other New York hospital.
And so, maybe talk for a minute, if you would, about the religion piece there. Was that part of, and I may be jumping to a conclusion here, but part of why it took so long for the Family Healthcare Decisions Act to get implemented? Was that part of the conversation?
Yes, it was. It was. As I remember, there was a pretty broad consensus on the need for this law and the basic principles of the law for many years, but for maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years before it was finally enacted, there was a dispute over really two provisions in it. One had to do with a discussion about a pregnant woman and the impact of the decision on the fetus, and another had to do with on the surrogate priority list, whether there ought to be a place for domestic partner. Now, that issue became moot later when New York recognized same-sex marriage, but at the time, that was a controversial issue. So one of those, if I remember right, the Senate wouldn't pass the bill unless there was some reference to the surrogate taking into account the interests of the fetus, and if and the Assembly wouldn't pass the bill unless the surrogate priority list included the domestic partner. So it was hung up on those issues for several years.
Wow.
It's kind of remarkable when you picture that the overwhelming number of these cases are going to be elderly patients in nursing homes where domestic partner and interests of fetus are not going to be an issue. But it did get resolved, and it got resolved more toward the Assembly version because for a year there, when President Obama was elected, there was a Democratic Senate and Assembly.
Yep.
So that's when it was passed more on the Assembly lines. My own view is I thought it would have done enormous good anyway that those issues were resolved because I didn't see them as central to what it was trying to accomplish.
No, we only have about a few minutes left, but I wanted to sort of ask you, what do you know about the aid in dying proposals in New York?
I'm not a big expert on those. I don't think if they were passed, I don't think the issue would come up very much. They do. They would set rules in New York that are similar to the rules that we're now seeing in Oregon and California, where a patient has to have capacity. They don't allow surrogate decision making for aid in dying, but they would allow a patient who has capacity and who meets this very strict terminal illness criteria to have a doctor write a prescription for them for medication that they could self-administer that would end their life. And we're not supporters of that in our system, but there are 2 bills that in the state legislature, actually 4 bills, 2 in each house, that would recognize that. I don't see that as a natural extension at all of decisions about withdrawal, withholding of treatment. I kind of see it as this very separate issue.
So, you mentioned Oregon and California, and that's you mentioned it specifically in relation to aid in dying proposals, but just in general with Family Healthcare Decisions Act, how does that fit in nationally? Does it fit in with what other states have done? Is New York sort of behind the curve, ahead of the curve? How does this fit in with other states?
Well, actually, I think there are now 5 states that permit physician-assisted suicide, so 45 don't. So I've got to say New York is still in the mainstream here. And as you may recall, there was a challenge to New York's assisted suicide is homicide in New York. It's a criminal offense for a doctor to assist in a patient's suicide. So some doctors challenged that. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld New York's prohibition on assisted suicide. So I think New York is still in the mainstream on that. But, we've all seen enormous changes in the past couple of years with medical marijuana and with same-sex marriage, and it'll be interesting to see whether this is one of those areas that changes or not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time, but I just want to thank you so much. This was a very great discussion that we had today. And for our listeners, again, you've been hearing from Robert Swidler, the Vice President for Legal Services at St. Peter's Health Partners. He really talked today about end-of-life care decision-making and the laws in New York that are impacting all of these decisions. So I just want to thank you again for coming on, and hopefully you'll be able to come on again as more laws and more changes are implemented in New York State.
Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for being on, Robert. We really enjoyed the conversation, and particularly want to really applaud the work that you've been doing in this state. It's very, very important work, and sort of supporting family members and supporting individuals in difficult times. And so I'd like to applaud you for that.
Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
Great. We'll have you on again in the future.
Okay, so long.
So you've been listening to The Social Workers here on WCDB Albany. Thanks for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks on April 5th at 9 o'clock a.m. Stay tuned for music on WCDB Albany.